Hey, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the National Humanities Center and our Humanities in Class webinar series. Tonight's session is titled Asian Americans, a History of the Fastest Growing Group in the United States. My name is Andy Mink, and I'm the Vice President of Education at the National Humanities Center. I'm very pleased to be joined tonight by Erika Lee, who's at the University of Minnesota, and by all of you. It's always honestly a little bit humbling to look through the roster and check through the chat box and see what a wide range of the geography that is represented in each of these sessions, including tonight's. It's fun to see Krista up in Corning, New York, all the way down to Lauren in Virginia, and back up to Mariel in Illinois, and of course, Los Angeles is in the house as they often are. It's important for us to be able to offer these kinds of conversations in a way that really does fit all the needs across the country for schools and for educators at a variety of levels. And knowing that you've just come out of class, you're likely just finishing dinner, you're more than likely shooing your cat away from knocking your Christmas tree over. It's nice that you're able to spend these nights with us tonight. If at any point you can't hear my voice, or if the webinar seems to be disrupted in some form, please use as your first solution to just log out of the room and come back in. You can use the same link that you received to join us originally. That will not disappear, and you will not disrupt the flow of the night. If there continues to be a problem and you can stay in just long enough to email me or let me know with a private message, I'll be happy to try to walk you through that. Almost always it resolves itself, however, when you log in and log out. I want to thank our education team, my education team staff and colleagues, Libby and Mike, for all the good hard work that they've done this semester. We've had a great semester at the National Humanities Center, and that certainly is highlighted by the webinar series that we've been able to host. Libby is our primary point of contact for not just the scholars as they develop the readings and the materials and the PowerPoint, but also with each of you. So if you have any kinds of questions about this first semester, if you need to pull together your documentation, if you've got suggestions for future webinars, feel free to reach out to Libby using the email on the screen. And Mike Williams is putting together our online course catalog, as well as leading many of our face-to-face workshops and institutes. Again, we very much encourage you to reach out to us through social media or through email. For us, it's very, very important that we really highlight the professionalism and the leadership of all the teachers we work with. The three of us have spent combined 27 years in the classroom, and for us, it's very important that teacher leadership and teacher agency is at the heart of what we do. National Humanities Center is located in Durham, North Carolina, very near Meredith Murphy, it looks like. And this is a space in which humanities scholars spend their days on an annual basis in an annual fellowship, creating the humanities, writing books, doing research, having conversations, designing and imagining digital projects. And it's that scholarship, that content that we feel is really at the heart of our education programs. While we have a deep belief in pedagogy and the ways in which the humanities should be approached, what we really, I think, offer is a direct pipeline, a direct access to emerging understandings on these complicated topics. And so it's important for us that we represent the scholars as colleagues, as conversationalists in these big, complicated topics. And ultimately, I think that means the humanities reveal themselves as the disciplines that are gonna save us. They're gonna help us figure out all these crazy things that are going on in the world we live in. Visit us in Durham anytime. Also visit our website to see examples of the scholarship and certainly examples of our education materials. In terms of the webinar tonight, you will hear my voice and Erika's voice. You will see a PowerPoint that has been developed to anchor the talk. We will not hear your voices, but your voices are an important part of this. Please use the chat box that's located at the bottom of the Coda Training Control Panel, just as Wendy Harris has from St. Paul, just down the street from Professor Lee, and Jonathan, just as down the street from me in Greensboro. That's where you're going to be asking questions or responding to things or chatting with each other. And I very much encourage you to, just talk extemporaneously. Don't worry about finding a pause or a break in the conversation you might be listening to. Just go ahead and pepper us with your thoughts and your reactions. My job as the moderator then is to bring that into the audible conversation, and I'll do my best to get your questions answered and address any kinds of concerns or curiosities that you might have. A couple of quick reminders about upcoming webinars, that is the spring semester webinars. I checked right before we went live tonight, and we have 2 seats open for the January 9th session with Martha Jones. Martha is a professor of history at Johns Hopkins and also a former fellow at the National Humanities Center. And she'll be leading a webinar titled Winners and Losers in the History of Citizenship and the 14th Amendment. We also still have 88 seats left with Akram Kader, who's a professor of history at North Carolina State, on understanding the modern Middle East. And for those of you who signed up for Johnny Smith's talk on Jackie Robinson and civil rights history, please note, you should note that that's been rescheduled from a fall date, December date, to April the 28th. Tomorrow morning, many of you are going to receive an email from me with a special VIP link. This link will allow you to register for a special January 7th webinar titled The Global History of Sugar, in which we'll be working with Mark Aronson and Marina Butos. They both are experts in the role of sugar, sometimes the barbaric role of sugar in the past 300 years, and they'll be tying it explicitly into the 1619 Project. If you receive this link, it means that you've attended all the webinars you signed up for. And we really do appreciate your dedication and your attention to those registrations. We've asked you, if you can't make it for some reason, and of course things come up, to remove yourself so we can add folks from the waiting list. All of you this semester who attended 100% of those sessions will be getting a special link tomorrow. And we hope you can join us for that invitation-only evening. A couple other reminders before we get started tonight. We are currently accepting applications for a 10-day institute at the National Humanities Center titled Contested Territory, America's Role in Southeast Asia, 1945 to 1975. This institute aims to really unpack the many layers, the complicated layers of and landscapes of Southeast Asia using history, political science, literature, economics, many different humanities disciplines, so we can better understand America's role in that region. This is a summer institute, and it does come with a $2,100 stipend. We are currently accepting applications through our website. They are due on March the 1st. We are also accepting registration for our online spring course catalog. We've got 8 courses that are currently slated to run for 5 weeks each. They come with 30 hours of professional development credits. So those of you who are adding these webinars up, 4 or 5, 6 at a time, particularly those of you in Southern California, one of these courses would knock that requirement out for you. I'd encourage you to take a look. We've got both content courses as well as pedagogy courses. The one that seems to be gaining the most attention right now is a course titled Let's Talk, How to Teach Civil Discourse in the Humanities Classroom. And we would love to have each of you join that. And then finally, for those of you in California, please note that we are currently accepting applications to a 2-day summit that we are co-hosting and co-leading with the Huntington Library in Pasadena. Applications will be due in February. We'll make announcements just after that of who's been selected. I think we've got quite a few applications right now, so we're going to be limited to 70 attendees, and we would love to have all of you in the Los Angeles area come out and join us. Mike, Libby, and I will all be there. We can shake hands and meet in person. Finally, I want to thank the Teacher Advisory Council for their ongoing and invaluable work. That includes Ginger Park, who's in the room tonight, who was with us in 2016-17. These 20 teachers and educators from across the country really do contribute their experiences and their expertise and their perspectives of teaching in the classroom in 2019. And what we aim to do is make all of our materials, all of our work be relevant and applicable to both the curricular and the extracurricular needs that you have. And I want to thank all of them for their ongoing and continued support. So as I often do, I share for particularly those of you who have not been in a webinar before, the details of the center, the way we like to approach this. That's also my way of inviting Erika Lee to the microphone. Erika, I've just unmuted you.
Yes, I can hear that.
Yeah, you're up in the Twin Cities right now. Erika Lee is the chair in immigration history and the director of the Immigration History Research Center at the University of Minnesota. along with several publications that might be very valuable as a follow-up to what we've done. I can't thank you enough for joining us, Erika. This is actually the second game of a doubleheader for us this week. On Tuesday, we worked with historian Zhang Hang from Brandeis University on Chinese history since Tiananmen Square. So more contemporary, more recent kinds of issues. But we really do appreciate you joining us.
Of course, I'm so excited to be here. I loved listening to all of the past courses. I want to take all of the future courses. I want to come to the Summer Institute. And I'm really happy to see the broad range of folks who are joining us online. I hope that Wendy from St. Paul dug out as I had to do today. We had a little bit of snow here.
This is going to be a very sort of casual professional conversation. I've given you the mouse and you can advance the slides at your own pace, but I often also like to start the evening with just a sort of an open-ended question of my own. And what I want our audience to really get from this too is the ways in which we can dive into any one of the points that you bring up. And I would encourage you to sort of follow the questions as they come. But I do have one quick question for you before we get started, and that is, we've got a growing room full of educators with us tonight. They all teach younger students, pre-collegiate students, many are high school, many are middle school, some might be elementary. And part of their job is to take these professional conversations with scholars like yourself and start to figure out ways to unpack that and share it with younger minds and help them developmentally understand these topics. But it's also, as you know, as an educator, professor, it's also anticipating the questions, trying to see what kids might be asking when these kinds of topics come up. So I've got a question that may seem a little silly, but I think it's a question that students might ask. My students would have asked, and that is, can you give your perspective on why Asian American does not have a hyphen? I know many ethnic groups, they sort of debate this. I think Asian American has been minus the hyphen for quite a while. Is there a reason for that? Why is it Asian Americans and not Asian Americans with a hyphen?
Yeah, that's a great question. There are some publications like the New York Times which actually still use the hyphen, but the term, as it was coined in the 1960s by activists, never had the hyphen. It was a very explicit move to use Asian as an adjective. So American was always the core. This was a generation that felt that their parents, their grandparents had never been accepted as Americans, and legally and politically, Americans of Asian immigrants could not naturalize and become US citizens. So claiming that American identity was extremely important during the civil rights movement as a desire to not only claim a place in the United States, but also assert some control. So the hyphen, I think for many Americans of ethnic descent, it feels like it's a split identity, and the removal of the hyphen is really meant to point to a more fluid identity that is, Asian descent, Asian as an adjective, but not split in half in terms of dual loyalties or dual identities. So I think that's the short answer. If I were in the classroom with students, I would turn it around and ask them to think about how they identify themselves. I think more and more, some of the labels that we have used and that have been part of US history and US society are not as useful for a younger generation. So I think that all of these things are up for grabs.
Yeah, that's a great answer. Thank you. And it's one of those little hooks that might be an interesting entry point for many of our teachers of younger students. Thank you for explaining that.
Of course. And the way that I've designed our time tonight is really to provide some resources for teaching. I have participated in and love and really depend on teacher institutes with K-12 teachers over my summers, and so I learn as much from them as I hope they do from my presentations. But there's going to be a number of resources that I'll point to at the very end of our at the presentation that I hope teachers can then download and use in the classroom.
Excellent, thank you. So you've got the mouse, and
Great.
And we're anxious to hear your talk tonight.
Great, thank you. So I'm actually going to start backwards. I'm going to start with the current day and then move back a couple centuries and then come back to the present. And it's very clear. You pick up any newspaper, you listen to the radio, and you read some of the blogs. Asian Americans are making news. There are reports that name Asian Americans as the fastest growing racial or ethnic group in the United States. There's just over 20 million Asian Americans now in the country. They make up over 6.5% of the total US population. But it's really the growth in the past 15, almost 20 years now, 72%, that is really quite astounding. Going from 11.9 million in 2000 to just under 21 million in 2015. Hispanics are the second fastest growing group. They increased by 60% during the same period. And Asian Americans are expected to increase by 130% in the coming decades. They are settling in places that have traditionally welcomed immigrants, like New York City, San Francisco. I know there's a lot of teachers from LA here tonight, but they're also coming to cities where such large-scale immigration is new. You can see Atlanta, a 365.5% increase in the Asian population in the recent decades, as well as Las Vegas, Houston, Phoenix, and my hometown of Minneapolis and St. Paul. Along with these other immigrant communities, including the growth in multiracial Americans, Asian Americans are part of America's transformation into what some call a majority minority country by 2044. But there's also Asian Americans in politics. 2 of the 2020 Democratic presidential candidates were or are Asian American. One, Andrew Yang, is a former tech executive. Another, Kamala Harris, who just dropped out, a US Senator of South Asian and African American descent. In a congressional race in San Diego, a professor at UC San Diego, Tom Wong, has recently announced his bid for Congress. He's vying to become the first formally undocumented Asian American or Pacific Islander member of Congress. This is quite a reflection of political progress for a group that had, until the mid-20th century, been barred from becoming naturalized citizens. There are also reports that emphasize how Asian Americans are the highest income, best educated racial group in the US. Asian Americans, some researchers claim, stand out for their educational success as well. A higher percentage of Asian immigrants hold college degrees, for example, over the general US population. Asian Americans, as this Pew Research Center report titles their report, are on the rise. They have made it as model minorities who outpace whites. I'm using air quotes. You can't see it, but air quotes around on the rise and air quotes around model minorities. But there are also reports that emphasize the persistent and generational poverty of Asian Americans. This report from California shows that nearly 1 in 4 are working but struggle with poverty, including some 44% of certain Asian groups. And there are stories in the news that focus on some surprising facets of Asian American history, many of which have been long forgotten or obscured. So on the left is an NBC News article from a few weeks ago that chronicled the death of Wat Misaka, the first person of color to play in the NBA. And on the right is a story about a petition in Berkeley, California to name a street for a woman named Kala Bagai, who I've written about, and I've had the pleasure of working with her family. She was an early 20th century South Asian American woman, one of just a handful who had come to the United States before World War II and settled in Berkeley with her family. Berkeley back then was not the welcoming place that it is known to be today. When they moved into their house in that city, neighbors deliberately locked them out so that they could not put their furniture in. But some several decades later, now she is championed as a hero, and there is a petition to name a street after her. The range of these stories reveal the great diversity within Asian America and across Asian American history. So one of the things that I always focus with my students on is on the very first day of class, I have them try to name, what does it mean to be Asian American? And they do a pretty good job at naming some of the more common ethnic groups, or certainly if they are of Asian descent themselves, naming their own ethnic group. But in fact, they often miss just the large swath of peoples. Generally speaking, Asian Americans are people who can trace their roots to countries throughout East Asia, South Asia, and Southeast Asia. But obscured by this broad definition of both Asian and Asian American is a staggering diversity of peoples. The Asian umbrella now includes 23 distinct ethnicities, speaking over dozens of language dialects, each with unique histories, cultures, languages, and other characteristics. So that when you're a historian who studies Asian Americans, it's one of the most important questions to ask is, well, what links all of these diverse stories together? Is there even one Asian America? This diversity will be one of our major themes tonight. And despite all of the newfound growth, Asian Americans and Asian American issues remain largely invisible in American life. This is a photograph, a very famous photograph marking the pounding in of the Golden Spike when the two railroads, the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific, met in Promontory Point, Utah, May 10th, 1869. Now, as many who study California history or many who study American history know, most of the laborers who worked on the Central Pacific, about 90% of the workforce, were Chinese immigrants. Yet, when it came time to document this momentous occasion in US history, the Chinese immigrants who were there were literally pushed out of this photograph. This is just one example of the ways in which Asian Americans have been written out of US history, have been made invisible in the very stories that they helped to create. When I give a public talk on the subject, or even when I'm teaching in my own classroom, there's a persistent message that I get, and that is someone comes up to me at some point and says, I never knew that this happened. I could be speaking to college students at an Ivy League school. I could be speaking to public school teachers and librarians, museum docents, or community groups. It doesn't matter. What this tells me is that despite all of the scholarship, despite all of the efforts by a number of community-based organizations and historians, this invisibility of Asian Americans, this idea of who gets to be the subjects of historical research, whose histories get to be preserved, by whom and where, this continues to be a problem in Asian American history, that we're not included as part of big American history, capital A. What most Americans do know about Asian Americans may be based on stereotypes of the Asian American model minority. This is the idea that Asian Americans have achieved academic and economic success by adhering to so-called traditional Asian values, such as hard work and perseverance. This message has become so common in American popular culture that it often obscures a long and violent history of racism and discrimination that Asian Americans have and continue to experience. And it also, yeah.
I'm sorry, Professor, if you don't mind, may I ask
Sure.
just a quick clarifying question? And I plan to do this throughout the evening, and I'll try to find a good space for you to pause for a moment. By the way, I do notice in the Wall Street Journal they use the hyphen, and I wonder about that choice and whether or not that's equally intentional. Going back to that picture, Jamie Beck asks whether there are any known photographs that capture the Chinese workers, particularly in Utah.
There are not. And one of the, so I'll get to this in a little bit,
Okay.
but there are many, many efforts and a number of books that have just been published this past year that have done so much to document the history of Chinese railroad workers. And I would be happy to share those references with them, but in terms of the photographic evidence, no.
Yeah, thank you so much. Jamie's in California, I believe, and I see Stephanie Narrow, a good friend from UC Irvine, is also with us. So thank you for answering that and pausing for a moment.
Yeah, no, good, thank you. So we've got this problem, one of invisibility and another one of a very narrow understanding of Asian Americans. I find that we're at a crossroads in terms of understanding the Asian American experience and also, especially, the Asian American historical experience. There's been so much progress preserving Asian American history, heroic efforts by community historians, activists, librarians, and others to save and write the first community histories beginning in the 1960s. So I'm pointing to the Angel Island Immigration Station Foundation, for example, but also the Filipino American National Historical Society are both long-term historical organizations. More recently, groups like Densho, based in Seattle, Japanese American historical organization, and SADA, the South Asian American Digital Archive, have done so much to bring the preservation of community history into the 21st century. Especially a group like SADA is doing, most of its collection is online, it's digital, it's completely publicly accessible. Densho has enormously helpful educational resources and curricula that you should check out for your classroom, specifically targeted for mostly middle school to high school. But a broad understanding and appreciation of Asian American history has not followed. The United States is still hampered by perceptions that the Asian American experience was or is tangential to American history. When we talk about race, for example, it's about African Americans. When we talk about immigration, it's often about Latinx communities. American history needs to reckon with the place of Asian Americans in the making of the United States, both in the past and in the present, not just as add-ons, but as central actors in America's history of immigration, race, and global connections. And sometimes we just need to take matters into our own hands. This is a photograph of a group of Asian Americans organized by the very well-known New York-based photographer Coolie Lee. He sent out a call to descendants of Chinese railroad workers to recreate that iconic photo of the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad in 2014. That was the 145th anniversary. This past summer, even more gathered during the commemoration of the 150th anniversary. And yeah,
if I could ask a quick question, I think this is interesting in terms of what you were just discussing. Suzanne Burton asks, and I'm going to rephrase it just a little bit. When you're talking about the misperception or the stereotype of Asian Americans as that high academic achievement, high motivation, etc. In her experiences, it seems like there are subcultures inside of that. And you spoke a little bit about the struggle with Asian American as an umbrella term when there's so many different groups inside of that. She notes that in her experience, Koreans, Indians, Chinese seem to have a different kind of perception than Laotian or Vietnamese or Cambodian. Is there that sort of subculture that's happening as well?
Yeah, it's not a subculture. I'm moving back to this earlier slide, which I would recommend to Suzanne to look at if she wishes. It's the fact that it's a function of our immigration system, who we welcome, and also who is able to come. So she's absolutely right. Amongst the groups of Asian Americans who report to have higher educational levels and higher income, those are typically either Asian Americans who have been in this country for generations, so like myself, 6 generations in the United States, or who have come since 1965 when we have explicitly privileged those with professional skills and education. So they are already coming with advanced degrees and with professional skills. Southeast Asians have come typically as refugees who have obviously fled war, been persecuted, have spent maybe a generation, like Hmong Americans, in refugee camps. So have come due to war and the conditions of being a refugee with limited educational backgrounds. So it's not a matter of certain groups have certain cultural values that support hard work and education. It's a matter of the skills and the environment from which one is already leaving, and also how they enter the United States. I hope that makes some sense.
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so let me move forward. Okay, good. So what I want to do tonight is to get at this point that, oh, that's too far. I don't want to look at Columbus yet, but to get to this point that you can't teach American history without Asian Americans. So I want to write Asian Americans back into American history. And for me, this is a story that spans centuries, continents, diverse peoples, and experiences. It's about how Asians came to America, but also what it means to be American in the 21st century. And like I've said before, there's not one single story, but many. And throughout this long span of history, I'm going to emphasize specific themes and connections, but I'm also want to introduce you to real people, some well-known, some less known, who made a particularly important impact on this history. And I think that this is an especially useful way of engaging with students as well. So the first theme, and now we're going to get to Columbus, is how Asian immigration is an integral part of world history and the history of the US's global relationships. So in my book, The Making of Asian America, I explicitly start with Columbus, not so much Columbus the man, but in particular what he represented. So when I was in college, the way that Asian American history was taught was it began with the California Gold Rush, when the world rushed in, not just Chinese miners, but also from Mexico, France, obviously Yankees from the East. These Chinese marked the largest mass migrations of Chinese to what would become the United States. But there were also many historians who started to question this beginning point, this first beginning point. And in particular, historian Gary Okihiro encouraged us to think about the when and where of Asian American history's starting points. What made the migration of Chinese to California during the gold rush possible? So when I started writing this book, I thought, well, let me go back just a little bit and sort of tackle this, and then we'll move on from the 1850s. But what I found was that there were a number of historical patterns and structures already in place before the 1850s Chinese migration. And I found that I had to keep on going further and further back, and started with Columbus and the West's search for Asia. So we know Columbus was looking for Asia and discovered America by accident. But still, the idea of Asia remained central to the invention of America and to Europe's colonization of both Asia and the Americas. This led to the first migration of Asians to Latin America across the Pacific. This is part of the ebbs and flows of empires and imperial power, because the Spanish were the first. And beginning in 1565, they began to connect Asia, their Asian empire, the Philippines, with their American empire, known as New Spain, through what was called the Manila Galleon trade, these massive trading ships from 1565 to 1815. Their primary purpose was to bring porcelain, spice, furniture, silks from all over Asia, pearls, diamonds, cinnamon, pepper, from all over Asia to modern-day Mexico, New Spain. Then they would return from Acapulco with silver from the New World. The Manila Galleon trade connected Europe, Asia, and the Americas together in a trans-Pacific trading network for the first time. But what I was mostly interested in was how this trade also brought the first Asians to the Americas. Somewhere between 40 to 100,000 Asians. They came as servants, they also came as slaves, and they came as sailors. Their journeys helped to lay the foundation for the later migrations that we often focus on. And I want to just introduce you to one person from this earlier history. Her name was Mira Catarina de San Juan, spelled M-I-R-R-H-A, Catarina, C-A-T-A-R-I-N-A, de San Juan. This was not her birth name, it was her Christian name. She was a South Asian woman who arrived as a slave in Acapulco on a Manila galleon in the 17th century. She was owned by a Spanish captain who brought her to Puebla, a town in Mexico, which was along the China road that brought these goods back and forth between China and Mexico. She worked in his household and became free upon her death. She was known as a healer and as a Catholic visionary who worked among the poor and sick until her death in 1868. In fact, Mira was so revered that when she died, the local Catholic church clergy nominated her for sainthood. She's also known as the inspiration for the La China Poblana, or the Chinese girl from Puebla town. This is the symbol of Mexican womanhood that was celebrated in the 19th century. She represented local tastes rather than imported European culture. And in this 19th century painting, you can see that these women have pretty unique dress and patterned skirts, scarves, styles that most historians think represented a sort of a legacy of the Asian textiles that first came during Mira's time. A statue of Mira still stands in the center of the city of Puebla today. Her journey from India to New Spain reminds us of the long histories that connect Asia to the Americas. But as the Manila Galleon trade brought Asians to the Americas across the Pacific, new voyages from Asia to the Caribbean and Latin America emerged from the Black Atlantic world of slavery. Following the end of the slave trade in the British Empire in 1807, Asian indentured laborers became the replacement to African slave labor. There were 430,000 South Asian indentured laborers who were sent to British-controlled colonies in the Caribbean, and 250,000 Chinese who were sent to Cuba as part of what was known as the global Coolie trade. These Asians worked along African slaves in conditions that were near slavery, or as some historians have claimed, slavery all but in name. These global routes built a massive labor recruitment and steamship transportation system that helped to put in place the mass migration of Asians to the lands that would become the United States after the gold rush. So these beginning points, I think, help us anchor the Asian American story, not just in a typical Asia to the United States, but also as part of a much larger global history, and I hope can help enrich some of the lessons on world history and also slavery that you might be teaching in the future. The migration to the United States has similar imperial roots. Just days after the British departed New York Harbor in 1783, the first vessel to embark on the lucrative China trade left from Boston. Americans were desperate to participate in the booming China trade, for to make money in China ensured the wealth of the new nation. And it helps to establish the United States as a new imperial power as well. So these goods, the porcelain that comes into New England, represents both America's fascination with Oriental goods, but also how important this trade with China was in establishing the new nation. The first Chinese to come to the United States came as part of these global trade routes. This is an illustration of Afang Moi. She's the first recorded Chinese woman to come to the United States. She was 19 years old. She arrived in New York in 1834 aboard a ship full of Chinese goods, snuff boxes, walking canes, fans, imported to satisfy Americans' taste for luxury items. She was put on display in New York City for 8 hours a day. Her job was to lure visitors who paid 50 cents to marvel at what the advertisement said was this beautiful Chinese lady, an exotic traveler from the Far East. The people who brought her over, they were two traders, two brothers who owned the import-export company, and what they wanted to do was show her so that people would come to her exhibit, look at all of the furniture, the fans, the silks, and then buy them. She was poorly treated. She was sitting there for 8 hours a day. They would make her walk around. They would make her use chopsticks. They would make her speak a few words of Chinese. She was a circus act. And in her later life, she actually traveled in the Barnum Circus. There's a great new book that's just been published by Nancy Davis about Afang Moi. But I think in Afang Moi, we also see the ways in which Americans view at least China, and then later more largely Asia, as something exotic, something that is so different and alien, but also something to be controlled. And her experience is a tragic one, showing both the status of what it was like to be both female and Asian in the early 19th century. So over the centuries, Asian immigration to the United States continued to be tied to world history, to trade, to wars, to changing international relations and globalization. This is an important theme in what we're going to be talking about tonight, but another second theme is how Asians became part of America's transformation into a nation of immigrants and where they fit in to the history of race. So let's turn to immigration first. It can be argued that no other group has represented the vast complexity, scope, and diversity of immigration to America than Asian Americans. They have, for example, been recruited, they have been brought, they have been sent, they have willingly gone, married into, adopted into the United States. They've come as refugees, as undocumented immigrants, picture brides, and high-tech workers. The very first, of course, came as laborers. Recruited into the country beginning in the mid-19th century, they helped to build America. These are some of those forgotten Chinese railroad workers, blasting through mountains to build the country's first transcontinental railroad. They mined for gold and silver. They worked in the lumber mills of the Pacific Northwest and on sugar plantations in Hawaii. They turned barren land into the vast agricultural empire that is the state of California today. But despite being, here's some photos of Filipino farm workers in Salinas Valley, Japanese farmers up in Washington, and Filipino plantation workers in Hawaii.
You know, Professor Lee, it's a good question I'd like to ask, actually. And in your work as an historian, I suspect that you're going to share, or you have shared in your bibliography, in your final slides, different archives and different places to find photographs like this. One of the advantages for the teachers is that you've been able to curate and bring forth so many just high quality sources. Where do you tend to find these kinds of resources, these kinds of photographs and imagery?
I can people see my mouse circling over
Yes.
this? Yeah. This is from the Densho archive. So that's one of the organizations that I pointed out earlier. Just DENSHO. It is phenomenal in terms of oral histories of Japanese Americans during incarceration, but also newspapers, private papers, government records, and many, many photographs like this. I believe this is from a University of Hawaii archive, but also, I mean, in California, there's the online California archive that has collected from not only historical societies, but also university collections, various different both text-based audio as well as visual sources as well. Today, it's so easy by doing a simple Google image search, and then obviously finding the original archive or collection. And also Wikipedia has done a good job at sharing publicly accessible content as well.
Great, thank you.
Yeah. Despite being indispensable as laborers, however, this is where we're transitioning from immigration to race. Asians soon became the targets of massive anti-immigrant sentiment. And actually, what I'd love for you to do while I'm talking is for you to use your chat box and share with the group what you think some of the racial messages are related to these two illustrations. The first one from the 1880s from a magazine called The Wasp, based in San Francisco. And the other one is an advertisement for rat poison. So
Great.
we know that these are not singular examples, but were just two examples of really widespread sentiment about Chinese immigrants.
Yeah.
Xenophobia that inextricably connected to the racial attitudes of both Asian immigrants, but also African Americans, Native Americans, and Mexicans. To me, we see that these two images clearly depict Chinese as something as less than human, as foreign, exotic. You can see some of the racial characterizations that I think, especially on the left cartoon, that you would see similarly related to African Americans. We also know that there's a class-based message here with the Chinese labor monopolizing all of the different industries, shirtwaist makers, cigar makers, box makers, while white workers are picketing in the background. So I see here we've got some of these same comments taking over. Wendy says all the laundry from Americans, animal-like. Yep. Stephanie says businesses, factories, capitalists preferred immigrant and Asian labor as they paid them less than white laborers, for sure. And then, yes. Okay, so now we're going to the advertisement on the right. So why, how is it effective to, or why is it effective to show a clearly Chinese man, right, with the queue, and the queue, the braid, looks just like a rat tail, and he's wearing the weird dress and the shoes and the coolie hat. Why is it effective to sell rat poison with a Chinese man eating rats? So let's see. Jamie says, makes me think that the Chinese eat rats. That's right, and that to get rid of them, you must buy this product. So there's this very common argument. You can still hear it today as a racial slur that Chinese eat dogs, that it's somehow they're less civilized. They have a uncivilized diet, animalistic diet. So if the Chinese can eat rats and get rid of rats, then this rat poison is equally rough on rats. These are, I think, I use these types of cartoons in the classroom all the time, and I think that it's helpful for students to see how explicitly racial the illustrations were in popular magazines in the 1900s. But I think it's been my experience that they recognize these caricatures as something that they see today as well. So to think about how persistent some of the images are. This cartoon nicely encapsulated the intersection of race and immigration. It was also published in the WASP. The WASP was the most popular illustrated magazine in the West, partly because both, like you can see in the previous cartoon and this one, they really perfected this color printing technique, and their illustrations were just beautifully illustrated and colorized more than any of their competitors. But they also made a lot of money selling anti-Chinese sentiment. And so if you want to start typing your comments here about this one, the first question I always ask my students is clearly, what statue is this image referring to? Here in the WASP is based in San Francisco, and you can see that our harbor is italicized, so a statue for our harbor, so in San Francisco.
Well, let's see what folks have to say. It'll just give you a moment to catch your breath and have a drink of water. We'll
Okay.
wait 5 or
Great.
10 seconds.
Great.
This is not an idle invitation, folks. Please chime in with your thoughts on the symbology, on the meaning, on the ways in which this particular illustration is crafted. We'd love to hear from you. Tell us what you think. Marie and Wendy are quickly mentioning the Statue of Liberty. Thank you, Lauren, fellow Virginian. There's Brittany. Take a moment and really look at all of the both explicit and implicit meaning in that image.
And if you can read the words that are in the rays around the figure's head, what you think that means.
Maybe what's underneath, just notice what's underneath the, what is that, the right foot?
Yeah.
Yeah, Jamie's
Yeah.
right, stepping go. Thank you, Jeffrey.
Yeah.
Yeah,
These are all great. Yes, I love what Chris just found out. I had been teaching this cartoon for years until I was looking at it on a much bigger screen and saw that the moon even has
oh, wow.
slanted features.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Great catch, Chris.
So clearly, what the WASP editors are alluding to is, hey, on the East Coast, you have the Statue of Liberty and you're welcoming European immigrants. Those are the immigrants that we want. But on the West Coast, this is what's facing us. And we want you, American lawmakers based on the East, to take us seriously. This is the menace that is facing us, an unlimited invasion from China. This animalistic, inhuman, bedraggled image of a Chinese coolie who is bringing opium. See what he's carrying on his left hand, and then the rays emanating from his head. You need to read them right to left because that is the way that you read Chinese. So filth, immorality, disease, ruin to white labor. It has already destroyed California. The foundation upon which the statue rests is broken. Ships are capsizing as they're coming forward, and as Jamie pointed out, the moon has even has Chinese features. These are the images that help to really mobilize Americans, especially in the West Coast, to pass some of the first discriminatory immigration laws in US history. And in particular, I'm talking about the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. These are the details. It bars the admission of Chinese laborers for 10 years. So the vast majority of China are working class. They are laborers. So essentially, this is a ban on nearly all of China's population. It allows certain exempt classes to enter, those who would help promote US-China trade or education or diplomacy. It's the first time in US history that that a single immigrant group is excluded based on race and class. And even though it's a temporary measure, 10 years, it keeps on getting renewed and renewed and renewed. It would not be repealed until 1943 when the Exclusion Acts are repealed, but Chinese immigration would not open up again really until 1965. Part of the story of Asian exclusion that is so important is based at the Angel Island Immigration Station in San Francisco Bay. This is where Asians entered the United States, and this is where the US's exclusion policies towards Asians would have been enforced. So just to give you an example, Angel Island was very often called the Ellis Island of the West, but really because of the two different types of laws and the discriminatory laws focusing on Asians, they could not have been more different. So for example, on Ellis Island, 20% of immigrants were detained. They faced detention periods from 1 to 2 days, but 98% were eventually admitted. On Angel Island, 60% of all immigrant arrivals were detained, so that's compared to the 20% on Ellis Island. Chinese, the largest group, faced an average detention period of 2 weeks compared to the 1 to 2 days at Ellis Island. The longest detention that we have found was 756 days. So remember, 98% were eventually admitted on Ellis Island. On Angel Island, 76% of Chinese applicants were rejected. They hired very expensive attorneys, and only after going through months of legal wrangling, most, 93%, were able to enter the United States. You can see from these photographs that through the exclusion laws, we've got the first medical examinations, the first interrogations, and the first detention center. So you know, so much of what we're talking about today about today's immigration situation is about the context and the context around detention. Angel Island represents the first time that we're really warehousing people in very unsanitary, crowded conditions, like many are saying is happening today. Angel Island's history of unequal immigration laws, detention, and discrimination explains why and how Angel Island remains a symbol of America's closed gates. And the reason why we know this history is because of poems like the one photographed here that somehow survived decades of neglect and many attempts by US officials to paint over, to fill them in with putty. But in the 1970s, Angel Island was about to be demolished, to be used as a movie set, actually, when activists and park rangers lobbied for its preservation. And since the 1970s, it has become a National Historic Landmark. And next September, the Angel Island Immigration Station is going to be opening up a brand new wing to its museum. It's going to be called the Pacific Coast Immigration Center. I'm going to be speaking at the opening in September, so I hope that you'll come join me if you're in the area. But the history of Asian exclusion was not just about keeping new immigrants out, it was also about expelling those who were already in the United States and curbing the rights of those who were American-born citizens. And to tell this story, I want to focus on a guy named Wong Kim Ark. And I know that Professor Martha Jones, who speaks about and writes about the 14th Amendment, will also be speaking about Wong Kim Ark as well. I'm curious to know how many of you have heard of Wong Kim Ark. So if you want to put your answers in the chat box, I'm looking forward to seeing that. Wong Kim Ark.
Let's do this real quick. We'll take 10 seconds. Yes or no, have you heard of Wong Kim Ark? Let's see the first person who says yes. You got to be honest.
Oh, yeah, a poster with his story. Someone has a poster. I want to know about that.
That's your Minneapolis friend, Wendy.
Oh, yay, Wendy.
Oh, a previous webinar.
Webinar. Great.
Yep. Nice to see you, Jamie, up in Albemarle. Wendy's got a Smithsonian poster. By far, though, a large majority no.
Yeah.
Tara said yes.
Okay, great. Wong Kim Ark, American-born. He looks familiar. I don't know about the Autry Museum. Maybe. Wong Kim Ark was an American citizen of Chinese descent. He was working as a waiter. He was born to two Chinese-born immigrant parents who were also in California. The parents returned to China. Wong Kim Ark went to visit them a couple of times, once in the 1880s, another time in the early 1890s. So exclusion law had been in place for about 10 years. He was 24 in 1894 when he returned to California after one of these visits. And to his surprise, he was denied re-entry into the United States. The immigration official at San Francisco wanted to make a test case out of Wong Kim Ark, and he claimed that although Wong was born in the United States, and therefore should have been protected by the 14th Amendment, he was not a citizen because his parents were Chinese nationals who were ineligible for citizenship under the exclusion laws. The immigration official ordered that Wang be, quote unquote, returned to China. Wang hired lawyers and claimed first in his case to the US District Court that he had a right to be readmitted into the United States based on his status as a US citizen under the 14th Amendment. The question for the court were these two listed here on the slide. Can children born of persons who are ineligible for citizenship be recognized as native-born citizen? Or, in other words, does the United States determine citizenship by sanguinee, by blood, or by jus soli, by soil? The district court for the Northern District of California ruled for Wang, but the U.S. attorney appealed the decision, and the case was argued before the U.S. Supreme Court in March of 1897. With a majority opinion by Justice Horace Gray, the court ruled in Wang's favor. U.S. versus Wang Kemark affirmed that all persons born in the United States were, regardless of race, native-born citizens and entitled to all the rights of citizenship. The Wang Kemark case has come under scrutiny, most recently by President Donald Trump in the weeks ahead of the 2018 elections. I don't know if folks would remember, but he started to question whether birthright citizenship should be granted, and what we should question whether birthright citizenship was working the way that it does. The Wang Kemark case has never been overturned, but birthright citizenship has continued to be an issue that many politicians have been turning to over the decades. The Exclusion Act was just the beginning of a larger campaign against Asian immigration. By the 1930s, all Asian groups, South Asians, Japanese, Koreans, would be similarly barred. These two cartoons, one from 1910 in San Francisco, shows the quote-unquote danger of Hindu labor. We've got the same sort of animalistic, uncivilized portrayal of South Asians, this unending line of laborers who will come and take jobs away in cahoots with fat cat railroad barons. And on the right is the cover of a very well-known best-selling book by Lothrop Stoddard, a eugenicist in the 1920s, called The Rising Tide of Color. Lothrop Stoddard argued that migration, especially from Asia, especially from Japan, along with growing military might amongst colonial European colonies in Asia and Africa, and growing militancy would spell the end of white world supremacy. And he argued that only immigration restriction would be the answer. Beginning in the with the 1917 Immigration Act, this is a law that also has been come into the news recently because of President Trump's travel ban on six Muslim majority countries. And many historians have pointed back to this law as the first time that we banned so many people. This 1917 Immigration Act did a number of things. It imposed a literacy requirement on all immigrants, for example, but in terms of Asian immigration, the most notable thing that it did was to create a new geographic zone called the Asiatic Barred Zone, which basically you can see covers a huge swath of the world from which immigrants were prohibited from entering the United States. So in addition to China, Japan, and Korea, the zone included all of these countries: India, Siam, which was Thailand, Indochina, which was Vietnam, parts of Siberia, Afghanistan, Arabia, etc. A total of 500 million people were affected by this ban. This law was in effect until 1952. Anti-Asian sentiment peaked during World War II, with many Americans, led by politicians and the media, believing that Japanese Americans represented a national security threat to the country. Can anyone identify who the illustrator is of this cartoon? You can see it on the, yes, right. And this is from Dr. Seuss's paper, Philip Geisel's, Theodore Geisel's papers at UC San Diego. He was very prolific during the war, and many of his cartoons are very anti-Japanese. The message in this one is clear, and it nicely encapsulates American public opinion. Japanese immigrants, Japanese in America, seem to be assimilated. They're not wearing those weird coolie hats and shoes and clothing that we saw from the 19th century Chinese cartoons. They're in Western suits, but they also clearly are all the same. And there's a gender component here as well. They're mostly men that we're looking at, and they simply cannot be trusted. They might be assimilated on the outside, but clearly they continue to be loyal to Japan. I'm distracted by Ginger Park's chat here. Seuss was such a jerk overall. And the message here is waiting for the signal from home, that they're simply just biding their time in the US, in California, Washington, Oregon, and once they get that signal from home, they're going to take that TNT and destroy the United States. It's these attitudes that lead to the wartime hysteria after Pearl Harbor that encourages President Franklin Roosevelt to sign Executive Order 9066 that requires the mass removal of all persons of Japanese ancestry from the West Coast. We're talking 120,000, 2/3 of whom were US citizens, forcibly removed from their homes, businesses, schools, and farms. You'll see in Executive Order 9066 that there is no mention of peoples of Japanese ancestry, but it is very clear from the context of the debates as well as historical documents that the only targets were Japanese Americans. The official rationale was military necessity. In other words, Japanese Americans, because of their Japanese heritage, were not real Americans, but rather a security threat. The leader who helped to enforce the laws was Lieutenant General John DeWitt. He is famously known for saying that Japanese Americans were an enemy race. He says, racial affinities are not severed by migration. It makes no difference whether he is an American citizen, he is still Japanese. Or in other words, a Jap is a Jap. Within weeks of Executive Order 9066 being signed, the US began what it euphemistically called Japanese American evacuation. A curfew was put into place. Once an exclusion order was issued, residents were generally given just 1 week to prepare themselves for removal. They were allowed to bring with them only what they could carry. Once they were evacuated, they were sent on trains to hastily erected assembly centers in California, Oregon, Washington, and Arizona. Some of these new homes were hastily refurbished fairgrounds or racetracks where the inmates were kept in former animal stalls and barracks. And then after the evacuation centers, they were sent to camps. They were incarcerated for the duration of the war without compensation, without due process or proof of wrongdoing. There were no individual hearings or trials. They were vilified as a group. not one Japanese American was ever charged or convicted of espionage. The responses to incarceration varied, but one person that I want to focus on is Fred Korematsu, and I would think that his name is familiar to many of you. Fred Korematsu was living in San Leandro, California. He refused to comply with Executive Order 9066, so he remained behind while his family went to the Assembly Center. He was discovered a few months later, arrested, and sent to prison. The ACLU approached Korematsu in jail and asked him whether he would be willing to test the constitutionality of the executive order. He later explained, and this is an oral history that's also located in the Densho archive, he later explained, quote, "I didn't feel guilty because I didn't do anything wrong. Every day in school, we said the pledge of the flag with liberty and justice for all, and I believed all of that. I was an American citizen, and I had as many rights as anyone else." From within the camp, Korematsu appealed the decision, and the case went to the US Supreme Court. In December of 1944, a majority of justices upheld the constitutionality of the incarceration of Japanese Americans. This ruling has stood as legal precedent until very recently, until 2018, when a new Supreme Court renounced it. But they renounced it while, ironically, upholding the so-called Muslim ban. And if you want to read about the majority opinion and the dissent from Sotomayor, you can find that online. After 9/11, Korematsu became a very outspoken critic of race-based discrimination, as well as a defender of civil rights. And this is a photo of him receiving the Congressional Medal in 2004. So the Japanese American incarceration story is one of America's denigration of Asian Americans, demonization of Asian Americans, and the tragic consequences that that led to. But World War II also points to a change in some of the racial attitudes towards other groups. This is where we get back to that diversity story. While Japanese Americans are incarcerated in camps, we see public opinion shifting towards Chinese and Filipinos, both groups which had been barred. And the reason behind this is purely international relations. We are China's ally. We are fighting along Filipinos. And part of this propaganda is to make sure that Americans can start to differentiate between the different Asian groups when for decades they had lumped them all together. We also can see this very clearly in the media. This is from Time magazine in 1942, an article that's called "How to Tell Your Friends from the Japs." This is trying to help readers distinguish between the Chinese and the Japanese. So they show these 4 photos of younger men and older men, and then they offer these very helpful rules of thumb. I always show this in class as well because it shows the ridiculousness of these categories, but also of sort of the lengths that the government would and the media would go through. So, for example, Japanese, except for wrestlers, are seldom fat. They often dry up and grow lean as they age. Chinese are not as hairy as Japanese, and they seldom grow an impressive mustache. Most Chinese avoid horn-rimmed spectacles. So this article, How to Tell Your Friends from the Japs, points to changes and divergence between Chinese, Japanese, and other Asian Americans during the war. With Chinese Americans, we see even more changes. The arrival of Madame Chiang Kai-shek, wife of nationalist leader Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek, to the White House, her very famous 1943 tour, which led to the repeal of the Exclusion Act, also signed by President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. As he signs it in 43, he says, it's time to correct a historic mistake. Oh, by the way, there's a great, if any of you know this podcast, Backstory Podcast is the history podcast, and we just did a special issue on Chinese in America. And then Andy, I want to check in on time. We have 10 minutes, correct?
Yeah, we do, and my job is to keep us on time. And I've been so entranced by this, I've sort of let it slip. But we have about 10 minutes left. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to pick up the pace a bit. We also see Asian Americans. Here's another slide of Chinese Americans as model minorities, a continuation of those themes during World War II. We have the, I'm having trouble advancing the slide. Okay.
I'm sorry, that was me.
Okay.
For some reason, something popped up on my screen and I was trying to get rid of it without you noticing. There we go.
Okay, here we go. We also have the first South Asian American Congressman, Dalip Singh Sand, who becomes a Cold War warrior. He goes around the world, but specifically to South Asia, talking about how democracy works in the United States. And he uses his own personal biography. His family had been barred. He had been barred from naturalized citizenship, but America found its way. It corrected its mistakes. And now here he is representing the United States as a congressman. These changes in racial attitudes coming fast and furiously after World War II are the roots behind this idea that I started out with again, the model minority, that Asian Americans were now friends and citizens, not the inestimable coolies, and also that they were good citizens, as opposed to the bad minorities, making very direct comparisons to African Americans who were, by the 1960s, organized around an unprecedented civil rights movement to end institutionalized discrimination. Not all Asian Americans liked that model minority label. They saw it as divisive, and they joined with many others in the anti-war movement, in the women's movement, in the LGBT movement, in the African American civil rights movement, to start their own Asian American movement. This is where that label, Asian American, comes into being. One of the activists was a woman named Grace Lee Boggs. She was inspired by the African American movement and started her own movement with her husband, James Boggs. They're very active in Detroit. They were involved in every movement in the late 20th century: civil rights, Black power, labor, women's rights, environmental concerns. She became an author in her 80s and 90s. She had an autobiography and a collection of essays, and I encourage you to look her up for more details. The 1960s also sees new kinds of migration: Japanese war brides who are coming, as well as Korean adoptees. And these two groups, along with many others, start to remake the profile of Asian Americans. But the largest numbers would not come until after 1965 and the signing of the 1965 Immigration Act, which banned discriminatory national origins quotas and which ended the era of Asian exclusion. The wars in Southeast Asia also forced millions to flee, and we also accepted millions into the United States, over 1.2 million Vietnamese, Lao, Hmong, and Cambodians. In Minnesota, we have one of the largest Hmong populations outside of Laos. And it's been our effort and our privilege to work with the Hmong community to help collect oral histories and digital stories with Hmong elders as well as with Hmong Americans. And I'll share some resources about that at the end. What we've seen over the past 50 years is a dramatic increase in immigration, not just in numbers, and we are not at record high immigration. That still is about 1910 or so, when we had the largest proportion of foreign born in our population. But what has changed is where people have come from. Before 1960, you can see most immigrants had come from Europe. After the 1980s, it's from Latin America and Asia. To put it another way, we can see in 1960, the 10 largest US immigrant groups are mostly from Europe. This is from Migration Policy Institute, by the way. They have a great tool where you can move backwards and forwards in time and get this kind of data. In 2017, it's mostly from Latin America and Asia. This migration has also included a great diversity, highly skilled professionals, as well as growing numbers of immigrants who have come without documentation. And in fact, Asians are the fastest growing undocumented migrant group. One of the highest profile of undocumented Asian Americans is Jose Antonio Vargas. He has a new autobiography out called Dear America. I would greatly recommend that as a book for high school students to read. And as part of the growing debate over immigration, and the backlash has been anti-immigrant and especially anti-Muslim hate crimes, which has affected a large proportion of Asian immigrants from South Asia, Indonesia, and other countries who are Muslim, as well as those who have been mistaken as Muslim, like Sikh Americans. A staggering 1,600% growth rate in anti-Muslim hate crimes grew in post 9/11 and has grown since 2016. And while the new immigration policies of the Trump administration do not seem to affect Asian Americans, mostly they seem focused on Muslim and along the US-Mexico border, in fact, they do. Legal immigration, for example, has dropped by 70% since 2017 as compared to the average rate this decade. And Chinese Americans have found that the growing trade wars have affected their ability to come in the United States as well. Given this history and firsthand experiences, Asian Americans are recognizing that they have a special responsibility to speak out against hate crimes, growing xenophobia, and anti-Muslim rhetoric. This slide is from the Day of Remembrance, which marks the day that Executive Order 9066 was signed, the 75th anniversary of the Day of Remembrance in 2017 here in St. Paul. Dozens of Japanese American community events took place in St. Paul. The local Japanese American Citizens League partnered with the Council of American Islamic Relations in a show of solidarity, as well as a commitment to struggle together. So where Chinese Americans also on the 135th anniversary of the Exclusion Act similarly rallied on behalf of immigrants today. So where does this leave us? The tremendous growth and change in the Asian American community shows how far Asian Americans have come. They have played such an important role in both historic and contemporary debates about the United States because they've experienced both the limits and possibilities of America, amongst the first to be banned, but now held up as model minorities. As diverse as these communities are, and through their complexity, they uniquely capture the story of Asian America and of the United States. At the Immigration History Research Center, which I direct, we've been doing our part to capture, preserve, and share immigrant experiences for the larger public and future researchers, not just the Asian American experience, but all newly arrived Americans. This is a slide that shows our archive where you can play digital stories. You can search for them by group, by theme. We've been also building a website that is now live where students can create their own digital stories and upload them to our archive if they wish. But all of the video editing tools, the prompts, the writing is all embedded in our website, which is also not only in English, but Spanish, Chinese, French, German, and Swedish. We also have curriculum that helps high school students, high school teachers, college instructors, English language learners, community groups to use our Immigrant Stories website. And this, I think these two next slides will be particularly helpful for teachers. The immigration syllabus is a major educational resource and website that includes major topics, questions, readings, and links to primary sources that offers helpful historical perspective on today's contemporary immigration debates. It's now used in over 100 countries. And we just published a major curriculum to help high school, college, and ELL learners to teach immigration. It's 140 pages for grades 8 through adult on why and how people immigrate to the United States. It was created with the Advocates for Human Rights. It includes lesson plans, fact sheets, maps, and in-class active learning worksheets. We created these projects because we wanted to make sure that today's immigrants and refugees had the opportunity to tell their stories in their own ways and to provide resources for anyone to teach about immigration today with the facts, the best scholarship, and easy to use materials. I hope that they're useful for you going forward, and I thank you so much for spending the evening with me tonight.
Thank you so much, Professor. And you're right, I think these last slides in particular not only offer a direct line to the scholarly landscape that you painted tonight, but also lots of really great resources that these folks can use in their classroom. Thank you again for joining us. Thank you for sharing your expertise. And I believe on that slide, you've provided your website as well as your Twitter handle. And I'm going to assume that that's not an idle invitation to reach out to you.
Not at all.
Right. Thank you. Have a wonderful holiday. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
And I want to thank all of our attendees tonight for joining us at this webinar. This is the last webinar of the fall semester, and we very much appreciate your attendance, your participation, your contributions. We hope that all of our sessions this fall have proven worthwhile and valuable for your teaching and for the conversations that you have with students of all ages. Please do follow the National Humanities Center and our social media. Our website is a great place to go and see the resources we have available. Our Twitter handle and our Facebook page also will keep you up to date on new initiatives and deadlines for the upcoming projects that I shared. We will not be doing any more webinars before the holiday. I hope all of you have a chance to just shut your door, get away to your families, and enjoy the holiday season. We will be returning with a special VIP session on January the 7th. Again, if you have attended all of your registered for webinars this fall, you'll be getting a link tomorrow. Thank you again for a great semester. Have a wonderful break. We hope to see you in 2020 at the National Humanities Center Humanities in Class webinar series. Good night, everyone.